through this time together today. All right, we do want to welcome everybody, and we're especially glad today to have Dr. Tate Cockrell with us from Southeastern Seminary. He's professor of counseling there, and we're glad that he was able to join us. Chris Allen had told us at the seminary that with everybody's schedule changing and everybody not traveling as normal, um, uh, that Dr. Cockrell and Dr. Shattuck specifically had said, please let us know if we can help an association. So we're glad to have Dr. Cockrell with us today. Dr. Jim Shattuck will be with us next Wednesday, but we do want to start with the word of prayer, but following that word of prayer, we'll let Dr. Cockrell go ahead and present for us today, and then we'll have a question and answer time at the end to share ideas and learn some more together. So before we go any further, let's stop and pray, okay? Lord, we thank you for this time together this Wednesday morning. Thank you for your grace all day long, Lord, for your ability to be all that we need. God, we acknowledge that we're desperate without you, and we're desperate for you, Lord, to have control of our lives and to be Lord of all that we do, all that we say, all that we pray. Lord, so guide us as we spend this time together this morning, and thank you for the privilege of connecting for your kingdom's sake, Lord, this day. So, Lord, thank you for Dr. Cockrell. We pray you bless him and his family through these times, and guide him as he speaks to us this morning, Lord, so that we might learn and be the kingdom servants you called us to be. Thank you for our family of churches, Lord, and for continuing to guide us through this challenging period, Lord, but thank you for all the ways you're showing yourself faithful as we trust and depend on you in these times. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, Dr. Cockrell, welcome. Go ahead and take it away, and we'll enjoy hearing what you have to say to us today.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with all you guys this morning, and ladies as well. Real privilege of mine to be able to speak to pastors. Let me just at the outset say, really appreciate the work that you do, leading, encouraging, ministering, in your local churches, no matter what your role is, lead pastor, minister, women's ministry director, youth pastor, whatever the work is that you're doing in the churches where you are. Really, really appreciate the work that you do there in the local church. I am a professor of counseling here at Southeastern, but also serve as a counseling minister in my local church here, Faith Youngsville, right outside of Wake Forest. And, so appreciate the work that you do and labor alongside you in the local church. I'm not one of those ivory tower professors who, loves to talk about ministry, but isn't actually doing ministry in the local church. So I've been in ministry for 30 years, celebrated my 30th anniversary in January. Done a little over 30,000 hours of counseling during that time with individuals, couples, and families. And in particular, during this season that we've been dealing with COVID-19 and the ensuing quarantine and everything that's gone along with that, I've had the opportunity over the course of the last month or so to probably interact with about 400 pastors. This is probably the 8th or 10th one of these events that we've done where we've talked to ministers about their self-care, the self-care in the life of the minister, just because it's becoming such an issue. In fact, just prior to getting onto this phone call, onto the Zoom meeting, we were doing our staff meeting by Zoom, and our ladies in our office who track our numbers and all of that, I was, doing some work with them. And 23 of our doctoral students, of our DMin students, have paused their program, like they've decided to take a semester off because of everything that's happened with COVID-19. So the work that you're doing, the stress that you're under is noticed. In fact, leadership expert Peter Drucker once said, and I was astounded whenever I read this the first time. He once said, the 4 hardest jobs in America are president of the United States, president of a university, a hospital CEO, and a pastor. Those are the 4 hardest jobs in America. So I just wanted to say I appreciate that. Appreciate the work that all of you do every day. You don't have to turn there if you want to. You can write this down, or you can turn there if you want to. Isaiah 49 is where we're going to start this morning. I'm going to send a handout to Bob to send to all of you. I'm not going to cover everything that's in my handout. I'm just going to try to hit the high points, spend about 30 minutes with you, and then really try to give you as much time for questions as I possibly can. But here's what the first 4 verses of Isaiah 49 say. Coastlands, listen to me. Distant peoples, pay attention. The Lord called me before I was born. He named me while I was in my mother's womb. He made my words like a sharp sword. He hid me in the shadow of his hand. He made me like a sharpened arrow. He hid me in his quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel. I will be glorified in him. But I myself said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and futility. Yet my vindication is with the Lord, and my reward is with my God. I read that passage, and it is very, for me, it is very, there's a big parallel between the servant mentioned in Isaiah 49 and what a lot of our ministers and our churches are facing right now. Man, they know they were called. They know that God's given them a task to do. They're willing to lay it all on the line. And they're getting to that place, though, where they're getting burned out. They're experiencing compassion fatigue. And they're feeling a lot like the latter half of these 4 verses. I've labored in vain. I've spent my strength for nothing in futility, yet my vindication is with the Lord, and my reward is with my God. The prophet Isaiah knew what it was like to labor for the souls of the perishing, and he knew what it was like to feel the crushing weight of responsibility of people failing to heed the word of the Lord. And that's what a lot of us are feeling day in and day out right now. So let me just hit for you a couple of high points about maybe some little preparatory work before we ever even got to COVID-19. Some of you have heard these stats before, but in case you haven't, back in 2009, Bill and Christy Goudier started an organization called Soul Shepherding to care specifically for ministers and their families. And they began collecting statistics on pastoral health, ministerial health. They began collecting stats on that. And here's what they found. And I'm not going to read all their stats. You can go to soulshepherding.org and you can see a ton of stats that they have there. I'm just going to hit a couple of high points for you of those stats. 75% of pastors report being extremely stressed or highly stressed. 90% feel fatigued and worn out every week. 70% say they're grossly underpaid. 78% were forced to resign from their church. 63% of those at least twice, most commonly because of church conflict. 80% will not be in ministry 10 years later, and only a fraction make it a lifelong career. 91%, here's the stat for us where we're going to conclude our stats. 91% say they have experienced some form of burnout in ministry, and 18% say they are fried to a crisp right now. There's another stat, and I don't have it on this sheet, but I have it in another presentation that I do that basically says, I believe the number is 70%. 70% of pastors report that if they could do something other than pastor, they would. If they could do something other than ministry, they would do something other than ministry. But most of them, because of their theological training, feel like they're locked into the profession that they're in. So on the handout that I send to you, I'm going to give you some categories of stats like emotional health and their family, their pastor's lack of soul care and training, and then some positive stats for people in ministry as well. For instance, in a later study in 2016, the Goudiers found that 78% said that if they had it to all do over again, they would still choose to be in ministry, right? Despite all the pains and all the struggles, they would still do it all over again. But whether or not you look at the old stats or the new stats, the truth is kind of undeniable, and that is stress-related illness, burnout, compassion fatigue. They are real issues that face people in ministry today. So I want to talk about just a couple of the big things that I want you to be aware of in your life or in the life of the people that you serve alongside, because you may not be in this place right now, but you may have some people in your life. You may have some people on your staff. You may have some other pastors, other staff members, support staff members that you know that are equally going through the same things that I'm going to talk about on this sheet. So one of the things that has happened, if we think about the underlying stress that all pastors are under right now. If you think about the underlying stress that kind of set the stage for all of this, if you couple that now with the unique challenges of COVID-19, it gets really, really complex. And here's what I mean by that. The nature of the quarantine and social distancing guidelines creates added stress and to the population at large, right? So we know that, right? So like there's been like a 55% increase in alcohol sales, increased prevalence of anxiety and depression, stress related illness has gone up. We know all of that is true for the general population. But some other things that have happened for you guys in ministry and for me in ministry is our primary means of ministering to our congregations have been fundamentally changed, right? So where we could minister in large group gatherings, where we would be able to see, life groups, small groups, worship gatherings, medium-sized gatherings like men's ministry meetings or women's ministry meetings, suddenly anything over, 6 people, 10 people is prohibited. So our primary mechanisms for how we do our jobs have now fundamentally changed. Here's what I keep hearing from all the pastors that I'm working with, and that is they continue to ask me, and I've asked the question as well, how is it that in the midst of a quarantine when we're staying at home, we're busier than we ever have been? I've gone to the office less than I ever have in my whole life, and yet I'm more stressed out and working more than I ever have. How does that happen? And the answer to that question, I believe we've got it figured out. The answer to that question is this. None of the responsibilities that every single one of you have on this call, none of those responsibilities for the most part have gone away. You still have to preach. You still have to care. You still have to figure out how to do a budget. You still have to do leadership meetings. The committee on committees has still got to nominate people for positions for next year. Whatever the things are that you were normally doing prior to the quarantine, prior to the virus, you still have to do all of those things. But now you have the added pressure of, I've got to find a way to care well for my people in a time whenever I can't get to my people and they can't get to me, at least not through the traditional means. And so the convergence then of these multiple stressors in a short amount of time have increased the demand on you for things like counseling and care ministry, right? So where every pastor, every minister has a certain amount of care and counseling that they do as a part of their job, what they're realizing now is that that's becoming an overwhelming part of their ministry, where instead of it taking 15 to 20% of their ministry, now it's taking 45 and 50% of their ministry. But all the other things that they were doing, like preparing sermons, that stuff didn't go away. Now, everything that I just said is true, and we haven't even talked about the fact that every single one of us on this call are also human beings who have families. So we also are having to process our own emotions about the virus. Right before I left my house, I was having to have a conversation with my wife and kids about schoolwork and about things that my wife needed to do, and the fact that she's a really, really big time extrovert, and she's missing being around friends and being able to interact with people the way that she normally does. And so aside from the caring that I'm doing for my congregation, aside from the caring that I'm doing for my students, my first ministry has to be to my family. And so I'm also having to face the demands of caring well for the people who are the closest to me. So all of that then leads me to this discussion of what is compassion fatigue? What does that look like? What happens when you have had to care so much for so long for so many? What is the potential outcome of that? What's the potential result of that? And the potential, it doesn't have to be, but the potential is you might run into compassion fatigue. So what is compassion fatigue? Well, it's called vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization. Basically, what it is a set of PTSD-related symptoms that come about as a result of working with people who have experienced trauma, grief, loss, and crisis. So when the caregiver, and that caregiver could be a doctor, a nurse, a pastor, a social worker, a youth minister, student pastor, women's ministry director, an elder in a church. When a caregiver is overly exposed to individuals that are experiencing crisis, and through our care, our rightful care of them, our rightful shepherding of them, we begin to experience PTSD related symptoms because of overexposure to those sorts of experiences. And they can occur as a result of one big experience, like one, just a few weeks ago, my hometown of Laurel, Mississippi, in Jones County, Mississippi, was hit by the worst tornado that they've ever seen in the history of Mississippi, and it ran right through the middle of my hometown. And literally, there's a dozen families that I know who lost everything, like their homes were completely destroyed. They're just going to have to be bulldozed and started over with from scratch. So pastors in that area who are caring for those sorts of families, that one-time crisis may cause compassion fatigue. You take a pastor who maybe 10 families in his church lost everything, and they're calling him, and he's trying to minister to them, and he's going by their house, and he's praying for them, and he's worrying about them, and he's trying to serve them and trying to get the church to serve them well. It's a one-time event, and that pastor could suffer compassion fatigue from that. Or it could be the slow drip, drip, drip of a lot of little bitty things, and we're starting to see that with COVID-19. There was the initial crisis of COVID-19 and the ensuing quarantine, but what has now happened is you have literally every single day, it's a new challenge that relates to the uncertainty of what COVID-19 is and when are we going to come back, and, what's church going to look like, and, are we going to come back in phases, or are we going to come back all at one time? And all of that is an everyday challenge or an everyday struggle. And what happens when we begin to experience compassion fatigue is we have an inability to react sympathetically to crisis, trauma, and disaster because we don't have any emotion left to give. It's hard to have compassion. It's hard to have empathy. It's hard to have, feeling and understanding, because it's almost like your feeler is broke, right? Like your feeler is just all filled out, and so it's really hard to connect well with people. And so at the end of the day, what ends up happening if you're not careful from that compassion fatigue is that compassion fatigue, it turns into burnout. It turns into low job satisfaction. It turns into individuals who want to get out of ministry. They end up saying, I can't do this anymore. And so I want to get out of ministry. I don't know that I can do this long term. I don't know that I can do this for a career. We see this, by the way, in a lot of beginning counselors and a lot of young novice counselors. They start caring for 4 or 5 people and kind of carrying their burdens and counseling them week in and week out. And the next thing you know, they turn around and they say, I don't know that I can do this for a career. Like I feel kind of like I'm an emotional mess more days than I'm not. So how do you recognize the symptoms of compassion fatigue? What are some of those symptoms that you would want to be aware of? And again, I'll send you a handout that's got a ton of these on there, but it's things like headaches and you can't sleep well, and your eating habits change a lot. You're exhausted all the time. You have a hard time resting. You may sleep, but you don't actually rest. So you wake up from sleeping, but you don't actually feel rested as a result of your sleep. You begin to feel depressed and anxious. Your cognitive ability begins to decrease. Some of you may have already noticed this, that maybe you're finding it harder to write your sermons. You're finding it harder to get some of the routine tasks done that you normally do, and you don't understand the reason why. It could be that you're experiencing a little bit of compassion fatigue. You have a difficulty detaching from work, like all of a sudden work, kind of just becomes your everything. It becomes your all. And you have a hard time leaving it at the office. Like it's with you all the time. Those are just some of the symptoms that you might see if you're starting to drift into compassion fatigue and burnout. So what I want to do in just a couple of minutes is give you what I call the phases of the compassion fatigue spiral. And the reason I want to give you that is because I don't want you to recognize compassion fatigue that you're fully in it. I don't want you to recognize that when you crash. I want you to recognize it before then, so that you could start to do something about it before you ever get to that place. So really quickly, I want to hit for you the seven different phases of compassion fatigue. Okay. Phase one, and I'll do this really quickly. Phase one is the crisis, right? So you're simply responding to the crisis. You're responding to the quarantine. You're responding to the virus. You're responding to the uncertainty. The crisis is what kicks everything off. The second phase is a lack of self-care. Because of the crisis, you're having a hard time caring well for yourself. You're not eating. You're not exercising. You're not spending time with your family. You're even finding it harder maybe to spend time in the Word. You're working all the time, but it's a lack of self-care. You're not setting appropriate boundaries because there's so many needs around you that you feel like you just have to give to everybody else. So there's a lack of self-care. That's number two. Number three is exhaustion. You're physically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually exhausted. Uh, Phase number four, you experience shame and doubt as a result of that exhaustion. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm really doubting my abilities. I'm really maybe even doubting my calling. I think maybe I'd like to just go do something else. I've had pastors tell me, I think I might open up a landscaping company. At least I could leave that job at the end of the day. They end up telling me things like that. So they end up experiencing shame and doubt. Number five, they experience cynicism. So at some point, they just turn negative across the board. They just begin to have an inherent distrust of other people, their circumstances. They're like, I can't continue to do this for a really long period of time. And so I might as well just give up. And so they adopt this real fatalistic and pessimistic outlook on their circumstances and on other people. Number six is failure. So they begin, because all of this stuff is happening in their life, now they're not effective. And so for pastors, their sermons aren't that good. They're not making visits. They're not making phone calls. They're not responding to emails. They just become really, really ineffective, and they begin failing at some of the routine tasks that they have to do day in and day out. And then that leads to the last stage, which is overcompensation. And overcompensation is when they decide they're going to kind of have a spontaneous recovery, and they're going to say, hey, I got to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. I got to work harder. I got to do better. I'm going to correct, or I'm going to bounce back and do better than what I was doing. And so they end up trying to work even more, which then cycles right back into another crisis because they're burning out even more. They're even more tired. They're more exhausted. And so we're right back at the crisis phase again. And now we're going to walk all the way back through those steps a second time. Every lap around the track that they walk through those 7 stages, those 7 phases, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so that's the phases of compassion fatigue. That's what that looks like. So the big question then for how we want to conclude our time is, how do you avoid that? How do you avoid compassion fatigue? Or if you're already in compassion fatigue, what can you begin to do to pull out of that? And there's 3 letters, and they're really easy because it's the ABCs, right? I want you to remember 3 letters, ABC: awareness, boundaries, and connections. Awareness, boundaries, and connections. And this is what we'll wrap our time up with today. So what do we mean by awareness? As a minister, you have to know what types of issues contribute to your stress level, thus increasing your vulnerability to compassion fatigue. You got to know what brings you life and joy, and you got to know what brings you stress and heartache. You have to have an awareness of that. And you need to learn to say yes to as many things as bring you joy, and you need to say no to as many things as don't. Now, none of us gets to create the perfect job description where you never have to do anything you don't want to do. None of us get to do that. You know that in ministry, your life is going to be a life of doing things oftentimes that you don't want to do. So, you can't say no to everything that you don't enjoy, but what you do want to try to do is find a way to at least balance some of those things out. But there are most definitely probably some things that you could say no to, but you're not currently saying no to. Let me give you an example of that just from my own life, just to illustrate it for you. So I told you I've done about 30,000 hours of counseling. Right now, I teach at the seminary and I serve at my local church. And so I only have about 10 hours a week that I can actually do in private practice counseling now. I do between 10 and 12 hours a week. And of that 10 to 12 hours a week, about 80% of that, so between 8 and 10 of those sessions every single week, are going to be sessions with couples who are in crisis. And the reason that I do those sessions with couples that are in crisis is because it's what I'm best at. It's what I get energy from. It's what I really enjoy. It's life-giving for me to help couples that are in crisis. It really and truly is life-giving for me to do that. So my buddy on campus, my colleague, Dr. Sam Williams, he's an expert in mental disorders. So he works with a lot of people who suffer from anxiety and depression and suicidal ideation and schizophrenia and a whole host of other mental disorders. And he and I will be in conversation. He'll say something like this. He'll say, Tate, I just don't understand how you see those couples, man, when they come in and they're in crisis like that, and they're yang at each other, and they're fussing all the time. And that just sucks the life out of me, Tate. I just don't know how you do that. And my response to him is, Sam, I have no idea how you sit in a room and listen to people who are anxious and depressed all day long. Like, I just don't know how you do it. Because I can spend 1 hour, one session with one of those people, and I begin having suicidal ideation as a result of being with them. Like, that's just not, it's not life-giving for me. It's just not. So what do? I refer everybody who comes to me who's looking for a counselor who is suffering from some sort of mental disorder. I end up, referring them to Sam. And if he has a couple that comes to see him that says, "Hey, Sam, we know you. We'd like for you to do our marriage counseling." He says, "Yeah, that's not really my cup of tea. Go see Tate. He's the guy that does that." There may be some people in your church that do things that you absolutely don't enjoy, and if you would just equip them so that you wouldn't have to do that, it would make a big difference in your ministry. But if you never take the time to actually find out, like, what are the things that you enjoy most about your ministry? What are the types of people that you like to minister with most? If you never have self-awareness of that, then, you'll never take those steps. You'll also find yourself at the end of the day, if you don't plan well, you'll end up planning in such a way that you'll have those conversations with more people than what you want to all on the same day. And that's usually not very helpful. So what I try to do is I try to find a way to say, okay, hey, if I do have someone who's depressed, let's not put 3 of those people in the same day. Let's just try to spread them out. As a pastor, you could do the same thing. And you also need to have an awareness of what brings you joy. I can't tell you the number of times that I hear pastors that whenever I say to them, what do you do for fun? What's your hobby? Like, what do you do just to unwind, to de-stress? I can't tell you how many of them say, I don't really have anything that I do. I don't really have anything that I enjoy. I don't have, I don't hunt, I don't fish, I don't ride motorcycles, I don't travel, I don't watch movie, I don't really have anything that really brings me life and joy. You need to have that in your life. You need to have leisure in your life that recharges the batteries in your tank. So you need to have awareness. You need to have awareness of what's going on internally with you. Don't always focus so much on what's going on outside of you, but what's going on internally with you. Secondly is boundaries. Learning when to say yes and learning how to say no. Practicing excellent self-care is something that you'll have to do for yourself. Having been in ministry for the length of time that I've been in ministry, there is one undisputable fact about most churches. I'm not going to say all, but there is one undisputable fact about most churches, and that is they will take as much of you they will take as much of you as you're willing to give. And so by and large, our congregations are not going to be the people who come to us and say, "Now, Pastor, you're working too hard. You need to slow down." And if they do say that, this is what I found. If they do say that, they mean that about stuff you're doing for somebody else, not stuff you're doing for them. So they want you to do less. They just don't want you to do less for them. Right? I use the example of my boss, one of my bosses, Dr. Al James, who's a fantastic guy and a wonderful boss. And every year during my evaluation, he writes this line on my evaluation. It says, "Tate, you need to learn to say no more." And then in parentheses, he puts, "to everybody except for me." Right? Like, he wants me to set boundaries. He wants me to teach less. He wants me to do less. He just doesn't want me to do that in any of the areas that actually impacts what he does as a boss. Right? So, like, don't say no to me. Right? And that's the way a lot of our church members are. And so you have to be the one to set boundaries because people aren't going to do that for you. You have to be the one that puts the boundaries in, that builds things into your schedule that are priorities for you. So let me give you a practical example of that. Today, by God's grace, and I'm very grateful for the fact that you're here, by God's grace, there's 17 of you on this call. How on earth did you possibly make this call in the midst of everything that's going on? You made this call by probably putting it as a calendar. You put a calendar invite on your calendar. You maybe set a reminder on your phone. Maybe you wrote it on a postcard. Maybe you told your secretary or a buddy to remind you about the fact that this was going on. Because you prioritized this, you found a way to make it happen. I'm pretty amazed at the number of pastors, church ministers that I run across who don't schedule important things in their life that care well for themselves. Putting on their calendar, for instance, things like time with their family. Putting things on their calendar like time with their wife or their husband, or time for exercise, or time for a meal, or time in God's word. They don't put those things on their calendar. They put all their meetings on calendars. But what that says when we don't schedule those things that should be priorities is it says, we don't deem this as important enough for me to dedicate actual time for it. Dave Ramsey once said, you should never ask your money where it went. You should always tell your money where you want it to go. I believe our time is the same way. You should never ask your time where it went. You should always tell your time where you want it to go. So the right things get the right priorities, right? So if your first ministry is to your family, then there better be some appointments on that calendar that care well for your spouse and for your children. And if taking care of yourself, if the only way that you can have longevity in ministry is to care well for yourself, then there ought to be some things on that calendar that indicate that you're caring well for yourself. I'm always amazed in my own life, by the way, because I do this as well. I am always amazed at how we as ministers think that somehow we're better than Jesus. And while he required rest and he required time away from the multitudes and he required time away just to be with the individuals who were closest to him, while he needed that, we don't actually need that. While Jesus did not sacrifice every single bit of his time every day for the needs of other people, somehow we feel like that's our requirement. We feel like that's the sacrifice that we're to make in ministry. And I don't see that in the example of Jesus. Are we called to sacrifice for our churches, for our congregations, for other people? No question about it. There is no question about that. Are there times when we have to sacrifice? Yes. Do we live a life of sacrifice? I do believe that we do. But there is a point where I believe sacrifice becomes sin, where sacrifice becomes, I'm laying my life down on the altar in such a way that it's unhealthy because I'm not going to be able to care well. I've said for many years, that I want to do this thing called ministry. I want to do it for a lifetime. And I don't want to be one of those people that flames out. I don't want to be one of those people that flames out because I burn out, nor do I want to be one of those people that burn out and end up having a moral failure. So I'm kicked out because I end up making really, really bad decisions as a result of the stress that I'm experiencing in my life. And so you need to learn to set boundaries. You need to learn to say no. You need to learn to say yes to the right things and no to the wrong things and put things on your calendar that actually matter. Awareness, boundaries. The last one is C, connections. You need to have connections. A couple of those stats that I have for you on the sheet that I'll send to Bob to send out to all of you. A couple of those stats relate to how few people in ministry actually have good friends, true friends, accountability partners, individuals that they can be real with. They don't have anyone that they would consider to be a really close friend that they can be open and honest with. And one of the things that I've discovered about compassion fatigue and burnout is that isolation, aloneness, and secrecy absolutely is like gasoline on the fire of burnout and compassion fatigue. You need to have the opportunities to talk it out. You need to have the opportunities to talk about your stress, process your thoughts and your reactions with somebody else. That is the reason why I believe God gave us biblical community. The Acts 2 model of the church, where they share everything and have everything in common, and they're in close communion with one another. That is not just for the people we serve, that is for us as ministers as well. We have a responsibility to also build in those kinds of relationships where we have a positive support system around us that doesn't fuel our stress, that it helps mitigate our stress. And so we need to have connections. And if you don't initially have those connections in your church or in your community, I've made this recommendation to people in ministry for a long time. I've said, when you arrive on the field of the place where you're going to serve as pastor, associate pastor, student pastor, youth minister, whatever it is, when you arrive on the field to a new town, there's two things that you ought to do right away. One, you ought to establish your primary care physician for your family so that you've got a good medical doctor that you can go to. And the second thing you ought to do is you ought to establish a relationship with a counselor in the area, someone that you can go and have a conversation with. I've been in ministry 30 years. I've been doing counseling about 27 of those 30 years. Probably for the last 25 of those 30 years, I've had at least, it's been different over the years, but I probably had the same counselor for about the last 12 years, but I've had a counselor for probably 20, 25, 26 of the last 30 years that I've been in ministry. And I don't see them every week. I don't even see them every month, but I've got someone that I can turn to that, man, whenever I'm really burdened and I just really need to ensure confidentiality and I can't talk to anybody else, I know I can talk to my counselor. And so you ought to have that awareness, boundaries, and connections. Those are three ways we can prevent and or crawl out of that hole of compassion fatigue. All right. I've gone just a touch over 30 minutes. There's a lot more on the handout. I've given you 10 practical steps you can do, like organizing your time and setting expectations correctly. And those are all be on the handout that Bob sends to you. But let me just pause right there and just see what questions you have that I might be able to answer for you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Cockrell. As we continue this time, we're going to try to do it so that we'll see how it goes. We're going to try to do it so that everybody, if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind, let's just listen for each other. If you have a question, I'll give you two options. You can either type it in the chat and you can see it. We can see it there, and then Dr. Cockrell can answer. Or you can raise your hand or get our attention, and we'll, instead of hopefully not 8 people, do it at the same time. But if you have a question, go ahead and either type it into chat or just raise your hand or say hello and go for it.
And as you're thinking about your first question, can I ask all of you to do this for me really quickly, just because I've been doing this informal survey with every group that I meet. Should be down at the bottom of your screen or somewhere. There should be a button that says reactions, I think, that gives you an opportunity to react to what I said, to what I've said. And if you click on that button, reactions, there's like a thumbs up or a hand clap. How many of you would say that either you personally or you know someone that in the midst of this COVID-19 stuff and where we are right now, how many of you would say that you are recognizing some of these signs of compassion fatigue, either in you or someone else? If you would say yes to that, would you give me a thumbs up just so I can see what the numbers look like in this group? I'm trying to figure out. Good. All right. Perfect. It's very helpful. Thank you. Questions that I can answer for you.
Anybody have a question? Go ahead and speak it out if you do.
Bob, this is Reese.
Hey, Reese.
Dr. Cockrell, my name is Reese Linnell. I'm a pastor of a church plant. We're in our 13th year. I teach and advise at our local community college so that I can feed my family, and have been involved with the Metrolina Association, I believe, all of that time. It's not a question, but a word of encouragement. That is probably the most encouraging, helpful, thoughtful, compassionate, biblical word I have heard in months. And I appreciate it very much.
Wow. I appreciate that.
Very good.
I thank you for that encouragement, Reese. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Reese. Anyone else? Don't everybody speak at once.
I'm shocked that you guys don't have more questions.
I know. I was ready for a flood.
Yeah, me too. Me
I
too.
have a quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
If you recognize compassion fatigue in another person who might not, because a lot of times the people don't know what they're going through.
Right.
How would you gently begin a conversation with them to help talk them through their feelings and emotions?
Beth, it's a great question, and I've actually made this suggestion a couple of times coming out of this meeting to folks. This meeting might be a good conversation starter if you recognize that someone has the signs or symptoms. You might be able to say to them, let's just say you've got a friend, her name's Sally, and so you say to Sally, Sally, I participated in this Zoom meeting with the Metrolina, Association the other day that that speaker, he just blew me away. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to say that, but just say, I learned a little bit in that, in this Zoom meeting that I was in about compassion fatigue. And I've noticed, and only say this if it's true, like don't make it up, but most of us would probably be able to identify at least one or two symptoms, even if we're not in full-throated compassion fatigue. We could probably identify one or two symptoms, and you could say, I've noticed in my own life a couple of these symptoms that Tate mentioned. I've noticed that I've experienced those. Have you been experiencing any of those? And then give them a chance to respond to that. And if they don't identify it, just say, as I was listening to him talk the other day, I thought about you. I thought about myself, but then I also thought about you as well, because I'm worried about you and I'm concerned about you. And I don't know if you would recognize these things or not, but I've seen some of these things in you, and I'm just wondering if there's anything that I could do to help. And by the way, here's a handout that I got in that meeting that might help you understand that. Like that may just be a really soft, compassionate way to kind of introduce the idea that maybe something is going on in them. Does that make sense? Good.
Yeah, very good. We are also we're recording this call, so we're gonna post this video on our website. So that's something you could point someone to as well to watch and just listen. So that'd be good.
Bob, I have a question for Dr. Cockrell.
Okay.
Dr. Cockrell, I've been reading up from the North Carolina Baptist website and the Biblical Recorder, and the awareness factor that you brought up is definitely what we're going to have to be using, especially now as we slowly start working into reassembling again at the small increments. And one of my biggest question is, especially with my congregation being a majority older congregation, there's so much fear now, even though we have permission to come together, so many will be fearful to reassemble, to get things going again. But someone brought out the Jethro advice from Exodus 18 that Jethro gave to Moses about like what you just said, awareness and connection and bringing in others. What kind of can we do in advising others and even involving others in helping us to reassemble with so much fear and hesitation?
Such a great question, Michael. Such a really great question. And that question or a question like it has come up on virtually every one of these Zoom calls that I've done in assessing, regathering and, what are some tips that we might think about. And so I'll give you a couple of them that we've been discussing over the course of the last several weeks. One of them is that, one, you're going to have to be patient, and you're going to help your people understand. One, you'll have to understand, and your church staff will have to understand, and then they'll have to help their church understand that not everybody is going to be in the same place. When the permission is given that we can meet again, not everybody's going to go rushing back to the church.
Right.
Not everybody's going to be there, right? Like everybody's going to be in a little different place. And I used myself as an example in the last couple of Zoom calls. I used myself as an example, and I said, listen, at my church in Faith Youngsville, if right now, if they said, hey, you can start gathering again for large worship services beginning on Sunday, if we were given that, that permission to do that on Sunday, I said, me and my family, we'd go back to church on Sunday. We would absolutely go back to church on Sunday. My mom and dad, my dad's 74, my mom is 72. If I was living back in Mississippi with them and the exact same, permission was given to go back to church, I wouldn't go back to church right away. If I was responsible for caring for them, I wouldn't go back to church right away. And the reason I wouldn't go back to church right away would be because the fear that I might catch the virus, and not because it would impact me, but if I were having to care for my aging parents and were going to be in and out of their home every single day, I would be concerned that I might be asymptomatic and I might go into a home where I've got a mom who's 71. My dad at 74 he's the picture of health, but my mom at 71 is not the picture of health. She's got some health concerns, and I would really, really, really be concerned that I might be asymptomatic, that I may actually have the virus and not know it, and then transmit it to my parents. And so
Right.
even at 48, I wouldn't immediately go back to church right now if I were responsible for caring for my aging parents. So I think there's going to have to be this realization that while when permission is given, that we can come back, and while even the government may say we're going to do this in phases, your church is likely going to do this in phases as well, and your church needs to be given permission to be able to do that, and they need to understand that brothers and sisters in Christ may be in different places in terms of when they come back. So I think that's one thing to be aware of. I think the second thing, Michael, to be aware of is some of us, for the first time, if we've never done it before, and I know that this is probably never, this is probably won't apply to any of you, but some of us maybe for the first time are going to have to not only be really clear about our ecclesiology, but we're going to have to help our congregations be really clear about our ecclesiology, because here's what we're seeing. We're seeing right now individuals who are saying, hey, you know what? I kind of like this. I kind of like this church by Zoom thing.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie to you. I worship this Sunday morning with a Mountain Dew in my hand in my pajamas, and I kind of like that. I kind of think that's an okay thing, right? And so there's going to be a lot of people. I mean, we actually saw on social media just in the last week or so individuals talking about doing online church planting. Thinking that right. So we got to have an ecclesiology that really tells our people, listen, we understand you may not be at a place where you can gather yet, but as a church, we gather, right? So we want to give you permission that you may not be in a place where, you can do this yet, but we don't want this to be an issue where now all of a sudden, whether or not you gather is based on what's convenient for you, and just what your preference is and what you like. That there's a reason why we gather. There's a theology of the church and ecclesiology for why this stuff is important. And so I think as you get ready to roll out people coming back in, it may be wise for you to actually preach some sermons or do some videos on what does gathering mean, and why do we gather, and maybe even asking, like if you've got medical professionals in your church, and maybe even having one of them record a video on, hey, give us some wise counsel in terms of who should go ahead and start coming back versus who should not go ahead and start coming back. Who do we not only need to say, you have permission not to come back yet, we encourage you not to come back yet for the health of your family. We want to provide ways for you to continue to gather and connect without actually having to come to the church to do it. Let's get some people involved that actually, know the best policies for those kinds of things, so that we make those decisions in an educated way. And again, it's not based on convenience, right? It's based on what's going to be healthy what's going to be healthiest for each individual family that's involved. Michael, is that helpful for you?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And in fact, one little quick follow-up, if you want to address, because it appears there's going to be a serious mental barrier that we are also going to have to address, because everybody is missing the fellowship.
That's right.
Want to be together, and of course, when we get together, hugging, and that's a part of worship.
That's
now we got to say, you cannot touch.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right, Michael. I think we're going to have to provide them some guidelines that say, listen, we want to greet each other with a brotherly kiss, but not literally, right? Like we can't interpret that verse literally right now. At least for the time being, we have to understand wisdom, right? And so this is not the government trying to control us. This is, at the end of the day, this is wise counsel that, one, we don't want to live in fear. Okay, we don't want this to be this thing where, well, man, it's going to be a year before I go out. Like I'm not going back to that church, until a year from now, whenever all this stuff calms down. There may be some reasons why people have underlying health issues or aging parents or something like that, where that may be the case. But I think those situations should be pretty rare. We're going to have to help them understand that we're not called to live in fear, but we are called to live in wisdom, right? So what are the wise decisions to make? And let's have some guidelines. Let's make some encouragements to our people about what's going to be healthiest and not. We want to gather. I mean, we're still doing, as essential services for church, we're still doing some staff meetings, and like I Zoom into those staff meetings because it's more convenient for me. And there'll be 6 or 8 people in a room having staff meeting, but each one of them is sitting at a 6-foot table by themselves. Like they're still practicing social distancing. Why? Because we want to make sure that we're being wise. We're not living in fear, but fear in and of itself is not bad. Unhealthy fear that turns into anxiety is bad. But, fear of a lion prevents me from going and walking up to a lion and having him eat my head off, right? Like I have a healthy respect for the lion. We have to have a healthy enough respect for the virus that we fear enough about the implications of what would happen if we get it. And in particular for those vulnerable populations, we don't want to live in anxiety, but we do want to have a healthy fear and respect.
Right. Amen. I think I may have to demonstrate how to blow a holy kiss at 6 feet social distance, a 6 feet high five, and a dab, how it can travel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Dap it up from a distance, you can do it. You can do it. Thanks, Michael. It's great comments.
All right. Thanks to everybody for being with us today.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, one more question. Yes, go ahead.
Dr. Cockrell, I am in that age. I was probably in your same high school class as your Ted, and my wife was probably in the same high school class as your mom. And being one of those senior adults, I do plan to be here the Sunday we open. One of the things that we're focusing on is the social distancing and trying to model that. But I would like you just to expand a little bit more, and I love what you said today on the issue of pastors not trying to be all things to all people, and you kind of alluded to that. And it's taken me years to begin to learn that. I struggled with it for 25 years or longer, and constantly, and I'm have an associate pastor now that's struggling with that.
Yeah.
If somebody calls, they got to jump out and take care of it. And so
Right.
you just address that real quickly.
Yeah, I can. It's such a great question, Larry, and thanks for addressing it. I think one of the things that we have to remember, and part of this is cultural. A lot of it was how you were trained and how you were brought up. And, I was brought up in the church where the pastor did everything, and you didn't really hear a lot of teaching on the pastor's role is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. There wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of that. There wasn't a lot of, oh, hang on, I'm losing my video. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. My video will reconnect here in a second. I think my hang on, let me just, I can switch cameras here real quick. Let me just do this. I have 2 cameras and one of them may just be shutting down. Let's do this. There we go. Okay. So I didn't hear a lot of that whenever I was growing up. I didn't hear a lot of it's the pastor's job to equip the saints for the work of ministry. It was the pastor's job to do all the ministry, right? So there's a couple of things I think pastors have to be aware of. And if you've never read Paul Tripp's book, Dangerous Calling, it's a really great reminder for us. Paul Tripp in his book, Dangerous Calling, he says, there were some myths that I believed early on in ministry. And one of the first of those was, I let ministry define my identity. I let ministry define my identity. In other words, and I do believe there's a certain degree of this that is true. Ministry is not just something we do, it is who we are, right? Like, I say this all the time, because we are called, my ministry is not just a job. It's not just a vocation that I can just leave at the office whenever I go home. But I do believe that there is an unhealthy side of that, Larry, where guys end up so finding their identity and so finding their joy and so finding their purpose in their ministry that the reason that they are motivated to help and to sacrifice and to do is because of what it does for them emotionally. And so they are constantly chasing the high. They are constantly chasing the approval. They're constantly chasing the praise. They're constantly chasing people patting them on the back. And so they're just always chasing that. I want I want to fill some void in my life. I want to fill some emotional deficiency in my life. And I don't want to give ministry away, because if I give ministry away and somebody else is getting the praise, that means I'm not getting the praise. If somebody else is getting the pat on the back, that means I'm not getting the pat on the back. And as a counselor, I see that in a lot of people in ministry. And so I think it's really important that we be really healthy emotionally as ministers, so that we can say, hey, you know what? I am a minister. I am God called. He called me to do this thing. It is part of who I am. But my primary identity is found as in a child of God. I am a child of Christ. I've been redeemed by him. And that is where my primary identity is found. And that way, I won't sacrifice my family for the ministry. You know, I mean, you see guys that, you know, because they want the pat on the back, because they're afraid the church isn't going to love them, they miss their kids' graduation. They don't go to their kids' ball games. They don't do date nights with their wife. They don't do any of that stuff, because they're so trying to get all their needs met through their vocation of doing their ministry. Like you, Larry, I did that for a number of years in my ministry. And then I got healthy and realized the freedom that comes from, man, when you surround yourself with really good people and you empower them to do the work of the ministry, the awesome thing is when people really love to do something, I don't have to stand behind them and make them do it. I have to hold them back from doing it. Right.
Amen.
So all I have to do is find the right people and equip them to do the work that God's called them to do. And then once equipped, all I got to do is unleash them. And then I get to enjoy their success. And I can get the pat on the back as being the one who helped train them, find them, train them, launch them, you know, and I can get some fulfillment in that. But if I can't ever get to that place where I'm okay with somebody else getting the pat on the back or the attaboy or the congratulations or you did such a good job, if I can't ever get to that place, then I'm always going to be the guy who feels like I have to do everything. Oftentimes, and hopefully you guys have seen this in ministry, a lot of times when folks aren't willing to do that, it's out of insecurity. They're really insecure, and some of it's just teaching. Some people were just taught from a very early age. Let's face it, early on in the church. I mean, you know, Larry, you're in those senior adult years. You grew up in the heyday of the pastor does it all. The pastor makes every visit. He does every single thing. Like that's whenever I was growing up, you know, 25, 30 years ago as a kid, that is what we saw in the church. And I don't believe it's an accurate teaching of what we do. What we should do the ministry, because we want to lead by example, but we shouldn't be the only ones doing the ministry. We should be launching people and equipping them to be able to do it. Does that help, Larry?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We're going to wind it down now, but please join me in thanking Dr. Cockrell for being with us today. I don't know whether we can clap or wave or whatever, but whatever you want to do. Yes, very good to be together. And I agree with Reese. This is some of the best material I've heard, especially through this time. And we're really grateful Dr. Cockrell was able to be with us today to share this. And we will be emailing out the handout he shares with us. We'll also post it on our website, probably as part of our blog post, our COVID-19 resources. And the video will be uploaded this afternoon, hopefully. So this will be available for sharing. Gary Baldwin had asked if we had permission to share this. I believe it's safe to say we do. So, so please share this as widely as you like. Share it with church family, other pastors you know, colleagues you know. So looking forward to sharing this and continuing to learn from it in the days ahead. So be watching for that resource from Dr. Cockrell, and we'll share that as we get it, etc. Before we have a closing prayer, just a couple things to remind us of before we go. Next week we will have Dr. Jim Shaddix with us on the same time, 11 o'clock next Wednesday, on May 6th. On May 7th is the National Day of Prayer. So we're going to have an associational Zoom call that morning. And a lot of our churches and other ministries have a noontime kind of gathering. So we're going to do at least a time at 8 o'clock that morning, a National Day of Prayer gathering Zoom call that'll be posted on our website, on a calendar, etc., Facebook. So join us for that. It'll be a Zoom call for National Day of Prayer, praying together that day. And then on a national call last week I was on, one of my colleagues was talking about how he was sensing a burden to encourage us to be praying as we look at reopening or reconnecting in church and in ministry. And he mentioned an all-night prayer, and God really planted that in my heart. So we're going to have an all-night prayer meeting on Zoom on May 8th tonight, start at 9 o'clock May 8th in the evening, and go to 7 o'clock in the morning May 9th. Not everybody has to be on, 2 o'clock in the morning. That's okay. I've already planned to take a nap the next day. But if you'd like to join us, we do have a sign up for that on our website. You can sign up for a 30-minute block or an hour-long block from 9 p.m. on May 8th to 7 a.m. on May 9th. But we'll be praying. The goal is to pray for all of our churches by name and pastors by name during that 10 hours of prayer. We'll be praying for every state during that 10 hours of prayer, governors, state leaders, etc. We're praying for our national government, other ministry leaders, families, and more. We'll be covering the whole gamut in terms of need of prayer, strategic kingdom prayer that night. So looking forward to that on May 8th and 9th. We are going to be continuing these calls at least through the month of May at 11 a.m. on Wednesdays. International Mission Board, one of the staff guys from IMB, is going to be with us on the 13th of May to talk about how IMB personnel around the world are responding to this situation and how we can be praying for them. And so all kinds of opportunities coming up. Looking forward to seeing how God continues to network us and keep us connected for the kingdom's sake. So again, thanks for being with us today. We have recorded this. We'll be posting the video later, but let's stay in touch and in prayer together. And with that said, let's close with a word of prayer. Okay. God, we do praise you today and thank you for the opportunity to be together. Thank you, Dr. Cockrell. Lord, we pray your blessing on him and his family and his ministry at his church, as well as at the seminary. Lord, thank you for a partner like him that can help us in a time like this. Lord, we just ask you to bless him and watch over him through these times. Lord, bless and guide each one of us. Lord, help us to know your protection and your provision as we trust you today and in the days ahead. Lord, give us wisdom to know how to depend on you. And thank you, Lord, for being all that we need. We trust you, we praise you, and we go with you now in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for being together. We'll be together again next week.
Bob, I'll have you that handout in your inbox here in just the next 10 minutes or so, okay?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
Bye. Take care.
You go up a bit.
Blessings to you.